Chapter 40. Peter delivered from prison. This chapter is based on Acts 12, verses 1 through 23. Herod was professedly a proselyte to the Jewish faith, and apparently very zealous in perpetuating the ceremonies of the law. The government of Judea was in his hands, subject to Claudius, the Roman emperor, who also held the position of Tetrarch of Galilee. Herod was anxious to obtain the favor of the Jews, hoping thus to make secure his offices and honors. He therefore proceeded to carry out the desires of the Jews in persecuting the Church of Christ. He began his work by spoiling the houses and goods of the believers. He then began to imprison the leading ones. He seized upon James and cast him into prison, and there sent an executioner to kill him with a sword, as another Herod had caused the prophet John to be beheaded. He then became bolder, seeing that the Jews were well pleased with his acts, and imprisoned Peter. These cruelties were performed during the sacred occasion of the Passover. The people applauded the act of Herod in causing the death of James, though some of them complained of the private manner in which it was accomplished, maintaining that a public execution would have had the effect to more thoroughly intimidate all believers and sympathizers. Herod therefore held Peter in custody for the purpose of gratifying the Jews by the public spectacle of his death. But it was suggested to the ruler that it would not be safe to bring the veteran apostle out for execution before all the people who were assembled in Jerusalem for the Passover. It was feared that his venerable appearance might excite their pity and respect. They also dreaded lest he should make one of those powerful appeals which had frequently roused the people to investigate the life and character of Jesus Christ, and which they, with all their artifice, were totally unable to controvert. In such case, the Jews apprehended that his release would be demanded at the hands of the king. While the execution of Peter was being delayed, upon various pretexts, until after the Passover, the Church of Christ had time for deep searching of heart and earnest prayer. Strong petitions, tears, and fasting were mingled together. They prayed without ceasing for Peter. They felt that he could not be spared from the Christian work, and they felt that they had arrived at a point where, without the special help of God, the Church of Christ would become extinct. The day of Peter's execution was at last appointed, but still the prayers of the believers ascended to heaven, and while all their energies and sympathies were called out in fervent appeals, angels of God were guarding the imprisoned apostle. Man's extremity is God's opportunity. Peter was placed between two soldiers and was bound by two chains, each chain being fastened to the wrist of one of his guards. He was therefore unable to move without their knowledge. The prison doors were securely fastened, and a strong guard was placed before them. All chance of rescue or escape by human means was thus cut off. The apostle was not intimidated by his situation. Since his reinstatement after his denial of Christ, he had unflinchingly braved danger and manifested a noble courage and boldness in preaching a crucified, risen, and ascended Savior. He believed the time had now come when he was to yield up his life for Christ's sake. The night before his appointed execution, Peter, bound with chains, slept between the two soldiers as usual. Herod, remembering the escape of Peter and John from prison, where they had been confined because of their faith, took double precautions on this occasion. The soldiers on guard, in order to secure their extra vigilance, were made answerable for the safe keeping of the prisoner. He was bound, as has been described, in a cell of massive rock, the doors of which were bolted and barred. 16 men were detailed to guard his cell, relieving each other at regular intervals. 4 comprised the watch at one time. But the bolts and bars and Roman guard, which effectually cut off from the prisoner a possibility of human aid, were only to result in making the triumph of God more complete in Peter's deliverance from prison. Herod was lifting his hand against omnipotence, and he was to be utterly humiliated and defeated in his attempt upon the life of the servant of God. Delivered by an angel. On this last night before the execution, a mighty angel, commissioned from heaven, descended to rescue him. The strong gates which shut in the saint of God opened without the aid of human hands. The angel of the Most High enters, and they close again noiselessly behind him. He enters the cell, hewn from the solid rock, and there lies Peter, sleeping the blessed peaceful sleep of innocence and perfect trust in God, while chained to a powerful guard on either side of him. The light which envelops the angel illuminates the prison, but does not waken the sleeping apostle. His is the sound repose that invigorates and renews, and that comes of a good conscience. Peter is not awakened until he feels the stroke of the angel's hand and hears his voice saying, "Arise up quickly." He sees his cell, which had never been blessed by a ray of sunshine, illuminated by the light of heaven, and an angel of great glory standing before him. He mechanically obeys the voice of the angel, and in rising lifts his hands and finds that the chains have been broken from his wrists. Again the voice of the angel is heard, "Gird thyself, and bind on thy sandals." Again Peter mechanically obeys, keeping his wandering gaze riveted upon his heavenly visitant, and believing himself to be dreaming or in a vision. The armed soldiers are passive as if chiseled from marble, as the angel again commands, "Cast thy garment about thee, and follow me." Thereupon the heavenly being moves toward the door, and the usually talkative Peter follows, dumb from amazement. They step over the motionless guard and reach the heavily bolted and barred door, which swings open of its own accord and closes again immediately, while the guard within and outside the door are motionless at their posts. The second gate, which is also guarded within and without, is reached. It opens as did the first, with no creaking of hinges or rattling of iron bolts. They pass without, and it closes again as noiselessly. They pass through the third gateway in the same manner, and at last find themselves in the open street. No word is spoken. There is no sound of footstep. The angel glides on before, encircled by a light of dazzling brightness, and Peter follows his deliverer, bewildered and believing himself to be in a dream. Street after street is threaded thus, and then, the mission of the angel being completed, he suddenly disappears. As the heavenly light faded away, Peter felt himself to be in profound darkness, but gradually the darkness seemed to decrease, as he became accustomed to it, and he found himself alone in the silent street, with the cool night air upon his brow. He now realized that it was no dream or vision that had visited him. He was free, in a familiar part of the city. He recognized the place as one which he had often frequented, and had expected to pass for the last time on the morrow, when on the way to the scene of his prospective death. He tried to recall the events of the last few moments. He remembered falling asleep, bound between two soldiers, with his sandals and outer garment removed. He examined his person and found himself fully dressed and girded. His wrists, swollen from wearing the cruel irons, were now free from the manacles, and he realized that his freedom was no delusion, but a blessed reality. On the morrow he was to have been led forth to die, but lo, an angel had delivered him from prison and from death. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, "Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews." The answer to prayer. The apostle made his way direct to the house where his brethren were assembled together for prayer. He found them engaged in earnest prayer for him at that moment. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said unto her, "Thou art mad." But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then said they, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, And when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, Go show these things unto James, and to the brethren. And he departed, and went into another place. Joy and praise filled the hearts of the fasting, praying believers that God had heard and answered their prayers, and delivered Peter from the hand of Herod. In the morning the people gathered together to witness the execution of the apostle. Herod sent officers to bring Peter from prison with great display of arms and guard, in order to ensure against his escape, to intimidate all sympathizers, and to exhibit his own power. There was the guard at the door of the prison, the bolts and bars of the door still fast and strong, the guard inside, the chains attached to the wrists of the 2 soldiers, but the prisoner was gone. Herod's retribution. When the report of these things were brought to Herod, he was exasperated, and charged the keepers of the prison with unfaithfulness. They were accordingly put to death for the alleged crime of sleeping at their post. At the same time Herod knew that no human power had rescued Peter, but he was determined not to acknowledge that a divine power had been at work to thwart his base designs. He would not humiliate himself thus, but set himself boldly in defiance of God. Herod, not long after Peter's deliverance from prison, went down from Judea to Caesarea, and there abode. He there made a grand festival, designed to excite the admiration and applause of the people. Pleasure lovers from all quarters were assembled together, and there was much feasting and wine drinking. Herod made a most gorgeous appearance before the people. He was clad in a robe, sparkling with silver and gold, that caught the rays of the sun in its glittering folds, and dazzled the eyes of the beholders. With great pomp and ceremony he stood before the multitude and addressed them in an eloquent oration. The majesty of his appearance and the power of his well-chosen language swayed the assembly with a mighty influence. Their senses were already perverted by feasting and wine. They were dazzled by his glittering decorations, and charmed by his grand deportment and eloquent words, and wild with enthusiasm. They showered upon him adulation and proclaimed him a god, declaring that mortal man could not present such an appearance or command such startling eloquence of language. They further declared that they had ever respected him as a ruler, but from henceforth they should worship him as a god. Herod knew that he deserved none of this praise and homage, yet he did not rebuke the idolatry of the people, but accepted it as his due. The glow of gratified pride was on his countenance as he heard the shout ascend, "It is the voice of a god and not of a man!" The same voices which now glorified a vile sinner had but a few years before raised the frenzied cry of, "Away with Jesus! Crucify him! Crucify him!" Herod received this flattery and homage with great pleasure, and his heart bounded with triumph, but suddenly a swift and terrible change came over him. His countenance became pallid as death and distorted with agony. Great drops of sweat started from his pores. He stood a moment as if transfixed with pain and terror. Then, turning his blanched and livid face to his horror-stricken friends, he cried in hollow, despairing tones, "He whom you have exalted as a god is struck with death." He was borne in a state of the most excruciating anguish from the scene of wicked revelry, the mirth, the pomp, and display of which he now loathed in his soul. A moment before he had been the proud recipient of the praise and worship of that vast throng. Now he felt himself in the hands of a ruler mightier than himself. Remorse seized him. He remembered his cruel command to slay the innocent James. He remembered his relentless persecution of the followers of Christ, and his design to put to death the apostle Peter, whom God had delivered out of his hand. He remembered how, in his mortification and disappointed rage, he had wreaked his unreasoning revenge upon the keepers of the prison and executed them without mercy. He felt that God, who had rescued the apostle from death, was now dealing with him, the relentless persecutor. He found no relief from pain of body or anguish of mind, and he expected none. Herod was acquainted with the law of God, which says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And he knew that in accepting the worship of the people, he had filled up the measure of his iniquity, and had brought upon himself the just wrath of God. The same angel who had left the royal courts of heaven to rescue Peter from the power of his persecutor had been the messenger of wrath and judgment to Herod. The angel smote Peter to arouse him from slumber, but it was with a different stroke that he smote the wicked king, bringing mortal disease upon him. God poured contempt upon Herod's pride, and his person, which he had exhibited decked in shining apparel before the admiring gaze of the people, was eaten by worms and putrefied while yet alive. Herod died in great agony of mind and body, under the retributive justice of God. This demonstration of divine judgment had a mighty influence upon the people. While the apostle of Christ had been miraculously delivered from prison and death, his persecutor had been stricken down by the curse of God. The news was borne to all lands, and was the means of bringing many to believe on Christ.